So, Nick, thank you once again very much for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to give you the floor. Professor Nick Couldry, The Space of the World, Digital Platforms and the Prospects for Human Solidarity in the 21st Century. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Bogomila, for the invitation to talk to you and to contribute to your debates this year. I really like the theme of your discussions this year. It's such an urgent topic, and I want to share with you some new ideas that I'm working on for a new book to be published maybe next year called The Space of the World. So there's the title for my talk, The Space of the World, Digital Platforms and the Prospects for Human Solidarity in the 21st Century. Obviously, I realize that the word solidarity has a very special meaning and resonance in the history of Poland, Solidarność. Quite clearly, we need solidarity if we are to have any chance of facing humanity's huge challenges of climate change, but also gender violence, racial violence, democratic collapse. But how can we think about the conditions for solidarity? I want to approach this difficult question from the perspective of space. Because for me, space is one of the least understood dimensions of what some call the digital transformation. We don't give enough attention, I think, to space, but maybe it's space that has been changing most profoundly in our era. This lack of attention to space is perhaps not surprising because the great phenomenologist from Austria, Alfred Schutz, said that the environment, the spatial environment, is one of the least clarified terms used in the contemporary social sciences. So, to get a clear sense of how much has changed since Schutz was writing, though, let's briefly go back to the time before the digital age, so part of the period in which Schutz himself was writing, before our digital age, before the commercial expansion of the internet. At that time, there was a lot of exciting new work being done in social and spatial theory in the mid-80s, early 90s. But what they talked about was very different from the things we talk about today. So two of the leading writers, Gregory and Ari, wrote about spatial structure, which they said was the medium through which social relations are produced and reproduced. So note that term, spatial structure, and the idea that it's just a medium for something more important, which is social relations. And there was also the idea from the Swedish geographer Alan Pred that the local evolves in dialectic with the macro level structural properties. Very traditional idea of big structure and then the local context where big structure is reproduced. So the emphasis here is on thinking about space, but thinking about space always in terms of something other than space, which is the underlying structure. At the same time, in the late 80s, cultural theory was also in a way thinking about space through what was known as globalization theory. And globalization theory, either at the time speculated about the large-scale global flows of culture, of meanings, or it insisted that we didn't know much about how meanings flowed locally, such as in the writing of the Swedish anthropologist Ulf Hannertz, who wrote, summing up the thing that he thought was most interesting and difficult to understand at that time, that as each individual engages in his own continuous interpreting of the space around him, how can we know that he comes to the same result as the next fellow? Strange language, gendered language, male language. But the key point there that's most strange is that what he was thinking about, the question he was asking, was about how meaning flows in space. Raymond Williams asked the same question. Other writers were talking about the change in geographies of discursive knowledge, the geography of knowing and unknowing. And the most critical writers of the time were talking about the spatial patterns of inequality and power, such as Doreen Massey, But in all this debate, which was the leading debate at the time, before the digital age, something important from our perspective now seems to be missing. What seems to be not talked about at that time, before the digital age, is the contribution of space, how space is configured, to the generation of knowledge itself, to the structuring of the types of things we can know. Instead, what we had was globalization theory, which, as we saw, just treated space as a medium through which culture flows, a sort of infinitely large space that culture just flows out into. This was a very simple idea, therefore, of how space relates to knowledge. And it said nothing about how different configurations of space might be the preconditions for different types of knowledge flows, how they might make a difference to how culture and meaning can flow through space. That's what they were not thinking about then. And now we came to the digital age, which we live in, an age whose consequences we are still trying to grasp today, consequences for the configuration of space, consequences for the production of knowledge, for the possibilities of democracy, and so on. So maybe now we have to confront fundamentally different questions from those who are writing before the digital age. Questions about how the configuration of space changes the type of politics that we can have. Let's try and think a bit more concretely about this difficult question. And to do that, I want to start with some basic points that we all now know on a daily basis, because these are the things that we live every day. We know that through our interactions on digital platforms, we don't exist on our own. We don't just exist with the people who are physically around us. We exist in a different space, a space of relations across platforms that exposes us the whole time to culture at a distance, other social actors at a distance, maybe actors we've never seen, will never see. We know this. We take it for granted. We know everyone else takes this for granted in a way that they couldn't before the digital age. But we also know that the platforms are doing something with space. They are exploiting our physical location. In the case of Facebook, because they see it as an evidence, the fact that I'm physically close to maybe a friend who's walking through the same city right now, they take that as evidence that we might be more likely to connect in the next 10 minutes, which could create a valuable interaction from the point of view of Facebook. It could encourage us to receive an advertisement related to the restaurant where we might both meet in 10 minutes' time. So for Facebook, our physical location is something to be exploited. Or in other ways, platforms like Twitter or now TikTok put us just into space, but a completely different space from anyone we've ever lived in before, an algorithmically driven space where we're exposed to messages from all around the world, controlled though by what the algorithm decides is most to our taste. However it happens, we're now living in a digital space where not just our own interests, but something else, the speed at which we engage, the intensity of our engagements is actually being maximized, it's being pushed to create not our value, but the economic value of the platforms. And that means that the space of relations in which we now exist isn't very different from the space of human interrelations that we existed in before the digital age. That space cannot anymore be a simple medium for what we want to express, what we want to circulate, because it's driven also by the interests of the platforms themselves that sustain the space. And because we spend so much time on platforms, in platform spaces, what we count today as knowledge, what we count as the culture, the society, the politics that we live, increasingly we identify that with whatever is circulating through the platform spaces we spend so much time on. These are really profound changes in the organization of space, in the configuration of space, that the writers of the pre-digital age knew nothing about when they talked about the relation of space to structure and knowledge. So they create fundamentally new problems that we have to think about. And these are not just intellectual problems to theorize, because more and more of us are seeing that this new way of configuring social space has increasingly urgent ethical implications. And in fact, in the past 5 years, citizens across the world, policymakers too, have started to feel that these new changes to the configuration of space, the space we live in together, are creating these important ethical problems. For a moment, I want to step back in history, though, and to remind us that this sense that something could change very radically through the use of computers in social life, there were people who were already predicting this many decades ago. First of all, let me step back 45 years to the great German historical sociologist Norbert Elias in his book, What is Sociology, from 1978, where he wrote about what he called figurations. I don't really have time to explain the term in detail, but what he was referring to there is that how our movements and our interrelations are arranged in space themselves have profound implications for the type of meanings, the type of life that we live together. And he summed this up in a very important sentence here about what social theory should be doing. He wrote that people often seem to forget, and he means some social scientists, they often forget that social developments have to do with changes in human interdependence. And so he says, if no consideration is given to what happens to people in the course of social change, by which he means changes in these spatial figurations composed of people, if we don't pay attention to the implications for people of these changes, then any scientific effort might as well be spared. In other words, there's no point doing sociology if we don't think about the ethical implications of the changes in the organization of space. And that was his sense 45 years ago. But I think he was fundamentally right, almost as if he had a premonition of how fundamentally space was going to change for us 40, maybe 30 years later, with profound ethical implications. But let's go back even further, a further 30 years further back in history, to the preface to perhaps the most important book in the history of computer science, Cybernetics, by the great German mathematician Norbert Wiener, who was living in the United States at the time. He actually wrote this introduction in Mexico City, where he was collaborating with a Mexican computer scientist. But he'd been working in the United States, doing some of the work on the building of the first computers, but also doing some of the work related to the background work that lay behind the atomic bomb. And he was writing 2 or 3 years after America dropped the first nuclear bombs on Japan. And this is what he wrote. It has long been clear to me that the modern ultra-rapid computing machine, of course, it wasn't so rapid when he was writing. It's very slow by comparison to us, but it seemed rapid to him. It's been clear to me that the modern computing machine was in principle an ideal central nervous system to an apparatus for automatic control. He means automatic social control. Long before public awareness of the atomic bomb, it had already occurred to me that we were here with computers in the presence of another social potentiality of unheard of importance for good and for evil. So here is one of the people who designed the very idea of a computer, already being concerned in 1948 that if we connect all those computers up and place them in a society, we will have a very different type of society with radically new possibilities of political and social control and influence. And very few people go back to this text, but I think it's a very astonishing warning already from the beginning of the computer age. Now, these concerns about what computers might do, especially if they're connected up into a wider space, were also reflected in broader concerns about the direction of computer design in the 1970s and the 1980s. Here is the MIT computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum in his very popular book, Computer Power and Human Reason, where he wrote that there are some human functions for which computers ought not to be substituted. There are things which we must not let computers do, in other words. Respect, understanding, and love are not technical problems for computers to solve. And then just a few years later, the Stanford computer scientist Terry Winograd and his Chilean collaborator, Ricardo Flores, wrote in their book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, a very simple but profound sentence, that in designing computer tools, we are designing ways of being. In other words, because computers are in the world, they are our interfaces for dealing with the world. When we change the design of a computer, we are changing our way of being in the world. In other words, we are designing a world when we design a software program for our interactions in the world. In other words, putting it in my earlier language, computer software can change the space of the world. And that's exactly what it has done because of how we embed computers into the world. I think we can still draw inspiration from these early ethical critics of computers, and especially of how computers, when connected in new configurations, themselves reconfigure the social world. But we also have to recognize something else, that we are now much further down the road that Winograd and Flores and Norbert Wiener saw, because we're 35 or 70 years on, 75 years on from their premonitions. We've been embedding computers in everyday life and space for at least 30 years now, since the internet became commercialized. In fact, we're so far down this road of embedding computers in social space that maybe we could say that computers are changing human nature. They're not what one philosopher called the second nature, which is our historical institutions that, of course, human beings have relied upon for millennia, but they're a third human nature, a human nature based in computer interfaces, and as I said in my book with Andreas Hepp, driven because of the way computers are designed and produced, driven by the economic imperatives of the data industries and all the wider goals of capitalist expansion that drive those industries. But this transformation of human nature is not an easy thing. It's full of tensions. It's deeply contested. And of course, it's happening unevenly, depending on where you go in the world. And maybe it's happening in a way that involves a certain violence to human nature itself. That's at least what the South African philosopher Akil Mbembe fears in his recent book, Brutalisme, where he talks about the becoming artificial of humanity. That's a very general term. So let's, again, try and remain concrete as we think about these issues. So let me just sum up where we've got to so far in the talk. I think there are deep issues involved in how space is today being reconfigured, not exactly by computers, because that would be technological determinism, but rather space is being reconfigured through our ways of embedding computers into every aspect and detail of social life. and our social interactions right across the planet. And we're starting to sense there are problems coming from this. This is the source of the techlash in the last 5 years. But at the same time, I believe there are still some important things which prevent us seeing what the problem is. And let me run through 2 types of problem that we need to think about, which we're not at the moment thinking about. The first problem is the way we describe what's going on with computers is still inadequate. We don't have the right language for capturing how much has changed. In other words, when we talk about what computers and software programs do and platforms, we often still speak as if computers do nothing but act as a medium for our thinking, as a medium for our social interactions. In other words, we ignore exactly the thing we should be talking about, how computers might be fundamentally changing the space in which we live our lives. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this from a very important piece of journalism, a good piece of journalism from the US Wall Street Journal, published in September last year. This was the Wall Street Journal's detailed articles building on Facebook whistleblowers Frances Haugen's revelations about the discussions inside Facebook, for example, about how Facebook already knew how damaging to young girls was the operation of the Instagram program. They'd done their own research. They knew the damage that was being done to young girls and the influence on their self-image. And Haugen revealed all this. And in one of their comments, the Wall Street Journal said that, well, Instagram is really the online equivalent of the high school cafeteria. Sounds sort of right, doesn't it? It sounds an easy thing to say. But actually, I think it's profoundly wrong. I would argue Instagram is nothing like a school cafeteria. I'm going to explain why in a moment. And the reason we can't see that is that we don't yet have the right language to describe how it is completely different from a cafeteria. So we need to find a different language to talk about Instagram and the role it's actually having in everyday life. Let's just think for a moment about how we know Instagram operates, and how we know that is very different from the way a physical cafeteria operates. So Instagram is a space of continuous data capture. I don't know what you think, but I think there is no physical cafeteria in the world, in your university, in your children's schools, which has a continuous archive of everything anyone ever said there and did there, that is controlled by the cafeteria, but which any visitor, when they enter the space, can suddenly see so that they can comment on what someone said a day ago and maybe say, that was a stupid thing to say. Why did you say that? It's not possible in a physical cafeteria, but it's normal in Instagram. And that creates new possibilities for bad individuals to exploit other individuals, to exploit the archive of Instagram to dominate other people. And this is what people are afraid of in relation to young girls and the way they're being influenced against their will on Instagram. There's another deeper aspect of Instagram as a space, which is completely different from a physical cafeteria. In the physical cafeteria, I look at you, you look at me, we're aware of that, and we're both looking at a third person. Each of us can exchange glances. This is reciprocal. According to Alfred Schutz, this is one of the fundamental aspects of human life, that we each aware of each other as we look at each other, a reciprocity of perspectives, as he puts it. But that's not the way Instagram or any other platform operates, because the way I appear to you is determined on Instagram by the algorithms determining what you see. And the way you appear to me is determined by the different set of algorithms determining what you see. In relation to each of our histories, those algorithms will be different. So the space we're operating in is not like a space where we look at each other, free to turn our head or not. It's a space instead where the way you appear to me, the way you're visible to me, is driven by algorithms, which are targeting this so that you are more likely to engage with an image of me or a statement by me when you find it. And these algorithms are there not to satisfy our interests, but to amplify the business models of the platforms, to amplify what the platforms want to amplify to generate income. And that's fundamentally different from a physical cafeteria. And then the most fundamental difference from a physical cafeteria, the most extraordinary of all, but the one we forget, is that Instagram is the world as designed by Meta. And it can bring us up very close, sitting at our desks, sitting on our sofa with distant actors, distant content, maybe difficult, distressing content, which the platform thinks is more likely to make us engage because the platforms make profit from engagement. This is then the core of why platform spaces are radically different from physical spaces, because they're driven by the way the business models of the platforms and the way those platforms are embedded in the organization of social life, completely separate from the way physical space is organized. So if those things are true, and I think they're just basic statements about the way Instagram operates, then Instagram is really not like a cafeteria at all. Instead, it's a meaning-saturated space of technologically enhanced, intensively managed behavioral patterning. Or as the legal scholar Karen Jung puts it, a space for the hyper-nudge, influencing every aspect of our actions. And it's a space that's based around a new type of governance, computer-based rule, you might call it. It's a new type of cultural space, which I think, as we'll come to more in a moment, raises profound issues of ecology, environmental issues for social life itself. Some people say we now live in a post-social space. That's the phrase of the great Austrian sociologist Karen Norsetina. But I think that phrase post-social is a little worrying. It implies we've moved beyond the social, so maybe we shouldn't worry about social problems. But of course, we do still worry about social problems because they're the problems in our shared ways of living together. So rather than talk about post-social, I think we need to talk about the radically new tensions, ethical and political, in the types of social spaces that we are now living in our new space of the world. So once we've understand this first sort of problem that we need to grasp before we can see what's going on with our social space, then we're ready to think about another problem on a larger scale, which is about the reconfiguration not just of individual spaces, but the space of spaces, if you like, the whole total space in which we live our lives, which is what I call the space of the world. Now, this is obviously even more complex than the transformation of one particular space. So what I want to do to explain how I think this has been transformed by digital platforms is I want to not do social theory, but to tell you a story, tell you almost like a fable that sums up how radical is the change in social space in the past 30, 40 years. So let's go back again to the late 1980s, the era before the digital age, but this time not think about social theory, but think about the everyday world and how different it was. Whether you're alive or not then, you'll have heard how different it was in the late 1980s. I'm old enough, of course, to remember this very vividly. So once upon a time, which is how in English we start stories or fables or stories for children. So pardon this way of talking, but it's a way of making things as clear as possible. Once upon a time, in the pre-digital age, we lived in democratic societies that were characterized by the centralization of power and authority, for sure. So in the late 80s, Thomas Hobbes' classic vision in his 17th century book, Leviathan, of how society holds together under an imaginary authority of the Leviathan, still made sense. At the same time, societies, Poland, Britain, US, were increasingly facing major conflicts over culture, values, politics. Less and less people were trusting in institutions, including political institutions. Less and less people were respecting central media. They wanted something different. They wanted what Nicholas Negroponte, the MIT data scientist, called my time, no longer the prime time of shared national television. They wanted my time. And that's when a profound experiment started. An experiment which I want to argue has completely undermined the central authority on which Hobbes's model of political order depended. What was that social experiment? Well, we know it, but let me tell it in a different way from the way you've heard it before. The experiment involved computers, but not just computers themselves, but connecting every computer to every other computer. That's the internet. It also involved massively multiplying the number of computers that could be connected. So it's amazing to think that back in 1994, the year when the first commercial web browser was marketed, there were just 2 million computers on Earth. Now there are 4.7 billion, which means that the number of connections between computers is trillions of potential connections. Now that in itself would not be a big social experiment because these would all be parallel connections. But that's where the most important part of the experiment happened, which was the idea of designing digital platforms, privately owned digital platforms, that would focus all those connections. So we would, billions of us, be all using Facebook at the same time to reach the diverse set of people we want to talk to. Platforms had a profound role in converging, focusing these trillions of new connections. And then you add another fundamental step, that continuous access to this converged space of connection happened not just through platforms embodied in static desktops, but of course through our mobile phones, through our smartphones, which we carry with us all the time. Because of this, but also because they were not legally controlled, platforms grew super large. Many of them are much larger than most nation states, than the biggest nation states. I would argue that these 5 changes have massively undermined the power of the authority of Leviathan, which Thomas Hobbes believed held together democracy, or in fact any form of state. Let me explain how this happened by taking that famous image of the Leviathan, which comes from the famous front cover of the first edition of Thomas Hobbes' book, and playing with that image a little bit to show what happened in the next 10 to 15 years. So I've broken up the image of the Leviathan so we can see the small groups within it. But what's happened is those groups are now more and more in touch with themselves, sending images to each other, sending photos, sending comments. And at the same time, they're also in touch with what other groups are sending. Those will be represented by the arrows. So you have a fracturing, if you like, of the body politic. A fracturing, which means that we spend more and more time in lateral connections, paying attention to each other, paying attention to what other groups are sending to each other, and much less time being oriented to centralized messages, to centralized authority, centralized media. Now, this might sound good. Maybe you would say this is what we want. This is civil society, enlivened, made more exciting. And of course, many people have celebrated social media. Maybe you might even think this is how we build solidarity in a digital society. But there's one problem. That this transformation, this new type of lateral connection going on inside the red circle that I've drawn at various points in the diagram, these interactions are not just happening naturally, they're happening in a way that is directly shaped by the business model of the platforms where we make those connections. I hinted at this before. Let's go through what the core elements of this business model. The first of all is that the platform wants to maximize the interactions on the platform. It wants to maximize platform traffic. To do that, it wants to encourage our engagement. The time we spend on the platform, the number of likes we send, the number of friends we have on the platform, and so on. To do that, it encourages us to do many things, including doing things where we circulate media that we've seen from other people, where we circulate comments on those media, and so on. A big problem is that, for example, Facebook's business model doesn't really care about the quality of the content that we circulate. It can be good or bad. It doesn't really care about the scale on which we circulate things. In fact, it wants us to circulate on the biggest possible scale to maximize engagement. Because Facebook doesn't care about those things, it means that because somewhere in internet space, somewhere amongst the 3 billion users of Facebook, or is it 4 billion now, somewhere in the world, there are guaranteed to be some very bad actors. Because of that, maximizing engagement, maximizing platform traffic means maximizing the circulation of bad information. Because, and there's social science to back this up, bad information, so-called fake news, is more likely to spread fast and on the widest scale than true information. And there's a lot more bad fake information than there is true information. Here I'm drawing on the paper which I wrote with Dipayan Ghosh of the Harvard Kennedy Business School in October 2020. I'll give you the link to that at the end of the talk. Now, I recognize I've given you a very simplified view of what has happened with digital platforms in the past 15 years, which is quite deliberate because I wanted to try and focus on the dramatic core of what has changed in the space of the world we're now living. Because what we can see through this fable is how we as citizens, as users of digital platforms, somehow we allowed the space of the world through which we interact to be fundamentally reconfigured. And so we've started to get a sense, though, as this has happened, and we've started to think about its implications. For example, after the revelations of whistleblower Frances Haugen, we've started to ask the question of how could it be that we've allowed political life in democracies and in non-democracies to be transformed in this way and to start to get into serious trouble. I expect you're very well aware of the concerns about the impacts of digital platforms on the quality of democracy. And that's exactly why you have this theme for your debates in this seminar series this year. And I think you're right to be worried about these things. So let me just, as I move towards the end of my talk, let me just summarize some of the core findings from political science and social psychology that might lead us to believe there is a fundamental problem in the space of the world, the digital space of the world that we've designed in the past 30 years. The first point is about polarization. As the leading political scientist, Shanto Iyengar from Stanford, argued in a paper 10 years ago, polarization is growing, by which he means not exactly polarization in opinions, although maybe that's growing too, but polarization in emotions, feeling we belong to one group that is fundamentally and emotionally different from the other group to which we're opposed. I think no political scientists disagree with this. This is a feature of American politics, but also Polish politics, British politics, French politics, and I could go on. It is the thing we're all worrying about in terms of the quality of democratic politics, and not just democratic politics. Okay, that's the starting point. More polarization. It's going up. Secondly, let's go back 20, 30 years before that to a fundamental finding of social psychology from Teifel and Turner, who argued what drives polarization in normal social life, long before digital spaces existed. They argued that polarization grows automatically in any space where people have an opportunity to send a signal of what group they belong to. Sometimes people don't receive those signals. It makes no difference. If you go into a supermarket to buy some eggs, no one cares what political party you're part of. They just care whether you bought the eggs or not. That's all that matters. And you're not part of a group by buying a type of egg or not buying an egg. But many other spaces are ones where you do get a chance to signal your identity. And in such spaces, Teifel and Turner argue, polarization automatically, without any planning, will grow. And their argument is strengthened in situations where people not just can signal identity, but they're actually incentivized to signal their identity. Then polarization is even more likely to grow automatically. Why does this matter? Well, I'm afraid the reason is very sad and very obvious, that social media platforms exactly are spaces where people are encouraged to signal their identity. We're told to make more friends, which is a sign of identity, surely. We're told to like what our friends do. Luckily, we're not able on Facebook to dislike, but liking is enough to signal identity, which according to Teifel and Turner is enough to start the cycle of increasing polarization. Then there are new platforms like TikTok, where we don't follow particular people, but the algorithm constantly sends us content to see what our identity might be on TikTok. And we find we're this type of TikTok user, which maybe we didn't know before because we weren't that identity until we went on TikTok. But once we have that identity constructed for us, we repeat it and we keep liking and sending on those things which confirm that identity. Again, we are signaling identity, which according to Teifel and Turner means polarization is more and more likely to occur in that space. We could sum this up by saying that polarization, which most of us fear is a bad thing in the political space, is actually a natural feature of today's digital platforms. When I say natural, I mean it's built in. Platforms are anything but natural. But if you're designing platforms the way we built them, then this will be an automatic consequence. But with one key other point, that this feature of polarization is intensified because of the specific business models of the particular platforms we have, which are designed to incentivize engagement and push us to like even more, to signal identity even more than we otherwise would, so that more money can be made out of advertising income. Then there's another factor, that in this polarized or potentially polarized space, powerful people want to have influence on us. Opinion leaders, such as politicians. Influence is picked out by marketing companies who are paid by how much they influence our tastes. And then those people who manage the bots, the machines which send out content, which is designed to be polarizing, to get us to click, to get us to comment, to get us to signal whether we like it or not. All of these actors have an incentive to take advantage of the situation which polarizing platforms offer. And then some political scientists add in an even more disturbing factor, which I hinted at, which is that in this polarizing environment, there's a specific incentive to circulate lies, to circulate fake news, as we sometimes call it, but it's more complicated than just fake. Disinformation is the better term. Disinformation is incentivized because, as some political scientists have found, for example, on Twitter, it's more likely to spread fast and on the widest scale than true information. And there's a lot more of it than there is true information. But if the platforms only care about engagement, then unless we change the way they operate, they will incentivize the circulation of whatever causes engagement, whether that's fake or not, which means they are more likely than not, to encourage the spread of false news or disinformation. And this has a final implication, which we have to think about, which goes back to polarization. Because the more polarized the space becomes, according to some political scientists, the less people trust in what circulates in that space. It makes sense, doesn't it? The more angry you are at what is circulating, the less likely you are to trust what comes at you, unless you know it from someone who's really close to you in your group. But then other political scientists argue that those people who have lower political trust are also more vulnerable to believe false information, because they don't have the rational grounds to say, I know that can't be true, because I also believe in these other things, which prove to me that this new statement cannot be true. But the less you trust in information, the harder it is to believe that any one type of information is true, which means that it's even harder to disbelieve what actually proves to be false. So you get a cycle. More polarization leads to more and more circulation of false information, increases mistrust, and then leads to more and more effective circulation of more false information, which in turn increases polarization. So there's a lot more I could say on that, and maybe some of you are experts in political science, which I'm not, and you will know a lot more detail than me. But I've done my best to summarize these literatures. And these are from a book which I'm still writing, so I'm sure there's a lot more I need to learn. But what I want to do as we move to discussion is to summarize the core points that are possibly depressing ones that have come out of the multiple perspectives on the space of the world that has emerged from the digital era over the past 30 years. The first is that platform spaces, even though of course they have benefits, they're very convenient, are naturally toxic spaces for human interaction. Secondly, the space of the world which we actually live in today is not just about single platforms, it's actually a network right across the planet of many platform spaces which interlink. So there's no way of hiding in one platform and keeping away from the dangerous impacts of another platform. And that leads us to an urgent question, which is what my new book will be about, which is whether this new space of the world that together we've allowed to be built in the past 30 years, whether this new space of the world really is compatible with human solidarity. Is it compatible with a good social life, with a good political life? And what if it isn't? What do we do then if this space is not compatible? I think that this means that we need two things from now on. First of all, we do need a critical theory of how digital technologies are, and already have been for 30 years, transforming the space of the world and what the possibly negative impacts of that might be. And secondly, we need a practical movement, I believe, to dismantle and to replace the current space of the world with a more toxic, with a less toxic one. Because I think if we believe in solidarity as a necessary precondition for humanity confronting the terrible problems we face, then we need to create the right space of the world where solidarity is possible and can grow rather than be undermined. So thank you for listening to my talk. I very much look forward to your questions. And there are some references, including the one to my paper with Depay and Ghosh. Okay, I'll stop sharing and hopefully I will start to be able to see you and see who's there, which I couldn't while I was presenting, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much for your inspiring talk and especially for those conclusions that there are some hopes for us in this situation. Now I would like to ask you, do you have any questions? And if you want to ask a question, please click the icon with a hand so I can see. Yes, Jan.
I should be visible now.
Yes.
So Professor, thank you a lot for this presentation. Your writings on digital media practices have been very inspiring for me. I'm looking forward to your next book. And my question is about the methodology of exploring the space, the platforms as spaces. Because in the article you've mentioned in Wall Street Journal, I remember it quoted a lot of social scientists saying that they cannot, for example, try to replicate the studies that have been cited in the article. They cannot autonomously verify the data because they have no access to it. We have to rely on the research that is leaked to us, and from the outside, as researchers, we cannot actually explore these spaces. And this, using this analogy of Instagram as a cafeteria, it's like this cafeteria is closed and we are only looking through doors and windows. We can observe the people, but we cannot like listen to them. We cannot learn about the ways in which the cafeteria operates, for example, explore its backdoors, etc. And it raises lots of challenges to us as researchers trying to, for example, learn about practices of detoxifying these spaces, because there are like such initiatives, but it's very hard to find them. We have to, I think, just stumble upon them and then try to follow like some people, some communities. But it's often a question of luck, of some like very dull exploration of those spaces. We don't have good resources. And from your perspective, what are those challenges and how can we overcome it now? And what are maybe ways to open those gates, like algorithmic transparency, for example? What are the ways for us as researchers to be able to explore these spaces much better? Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That's a great set of questions, really fundamental questions for what we do as researchers. The first point I make is that if we sense these things might be happening, then we must not give up. These things are too important to give up. It's too important to accept that Facebook or any other institution has a commercial right to prevent research. But this is the reality. And it's just an illustration of how we've allowed something of basic human importance, the space through which we interact with each other, like the town square. But except it's not like a town square, but like the town square was in terms of its function in human life, to be captured entirely and to become like a game managed from above by external managers. And one consequence is the obstruction of research. As we know, this is serious obstruction that Facebook in particular has been involved in blocking research and so on. But Google also in disqualifying critical researchers who lose their job. So it's a really big problem. How do we approach it? I guess we have to approach it from multiple directions. There are some very skilled researchers like the ones, and sorry, I don't have the paper in front of me with the names, but those who researched Twitter and researched did an experiment circulating demonstrably false statements with demonstrably true statements, and saw how quickly or slowly they spread. They developed some way of tracking this. There are experimental techniques which can be validated scientifically, but they're very hard to do. But they give us insights to the underlying conditions. Another approach is to work with people who used to work inside these organizations. So the Dipayan Ghosh, who I mentioned at the Harvard Kennedy School, he was a Facebook engineer, but he walked out of Facebook, and now he's writing more critical pieces, and we wrote this piece together, so have a look. So I was relying on his knowledge, really, of the way it really went on. It fitted with my instinct for what really went on. He's written a great book on this topic, if you're interested, called, I don't know how to put things in the chat, called Terms of Disservice. I can't see a chat function, but no, I don't know how to do this in Teams, sorry. But
there's a bubble, and when you click there, the chat will open. The bubble icon.
Ah, no.
No.
A bubble, okay. Right. I can't see that. I don't want to mess with anything. Sorry for my lack of familiarity with your platform. Anyway, he wrote a great book about this called Terms of Disservice. So that's his insider view of Facebook. Then we got other whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, who reported a lot of what went on, and that's why those Wall Street Journal articles are important, and the testimony she gave to the European Parliament, British Parliament, Congress, and so on. And that's the third way, I believe, is through social theory, which is part of what I think I can add to the conversation. Because I think knowing where we were before, knowing where we are now, we can imagine the steps through which we got to where we are now in an abstract way, okay, but we can imagine them. And I think that's the role of social theory, to take us through the deep structuring that must have changed for this new world to be possible. And that's why I really, to be honest, that's why I've developed this concept of the space of the world, because it seemed to me that in all the debates about Facebook and Google and everything that's wrong, and they're getting a bit boring now, we've been talking about this for 3 or 4 years, there was this one level, this sort of deep underlying level that wasn't really being talked about, which is, how come we're even in a space like this, where a business has the power to design how you and me interact? This is radically new possibility. How did that even happen? How was that space even constructed? And it's only because this space of the world exists, and it really didn't exist until around about, well, 2005, but initially from 1994, when the commercial internet opened up and the World Wide Web existed. And then you have these business models which connect every space with every other one, because you could have a series of silos where spaces are not connected up. But we don't have that space. We have a space of maximal connection. So it's a very distinctive space of the world. So I think social theory, I hope you agree, it's got some role to play in trying to grasp conceptually what's gone on here. Even though that won't help us work out how particular algorithms work for sure, which are a lot more complicated than that, but we know they work broadly in a certain way. And you can also finally go back to Facebook patterns. I'm writing an article with a Brazilian researcher right now, João Magalhães, about the early Facebook patents, often ones where Mark Zuckerberg is one of the authors, where they talk about how to design a sort of shadow social world, which is enough like our actual social world that we act in it and don't feel weird when we do our normal things like liking our friends, but actually it's the shadow world, which is completely controlled, every parameter, by Facebook software, and it's designed to maximize engagement in incredible detail. It's really fascinating reading these patterns, because you can see exactly what the goal was. And it tells you a lot of what you need to know about how things then ended up changing the way they did. So I think we have multiple methods, and we have to keep protesting against Facebook's refusal to let people in, because it's just not democratically acceptable. I hope that answers your question. But
thank you. Thank you. Yes, very, very inspiring answer, and I'll look into the works you've mentioned.
Przemysław Nosal, it's the next one.
Thank you very much for a very insightful and very inspiring lecture. I have two questions. The first one concerns the thing that you mentioned about, let's say, the toxic atmosphere. You mentioned the toxic atmosphere of the current social life, and I'm wondering, like, do you see this, that the problem is that the network, the shape of the network, or all this digital aspects of the current social life, or the business model which is built on this? Because let's imagine, I don't know, there's some the charity project of big website and social media without this focus on earning the money. Like, in your opinion, will be fine, like, just without this pressure on engagement and all that stuff? So that's the thing. First question, like, is the problem the economic model, or is the problem the network at all and social media at all? That's the first thing. And the second thing is that you at your last slide, you mentioned that we need to build a new critical theory to understand and to describe all the changes. And my question is, could you tell us, do you have any very specific theoretical inspiration to create this theory? Because, like, for me, it's very, very interesting that which kind of tools would be useful to describe it in the theoretical way. Because, for example, we have this lesson from action network theory, and yeah, we use it. But maybe there are some new tools. Maybe you will develop it in your book, but we are very, very curious about that. Yeah. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Semlav. Very interesting questions. Yeah, toxic atmosphere. I recognize I don't normally like making moral judgments, so it's a strong thing to say, although I believe it's true. Of course, there are many spaces on Facebook, like the Facebook group of my village in the countryside, that are not normally toxic, obviously, or the WhatsApp groups in my family, which is all very happy, sending pictures, everything's lovely. And it gives us a lot of happiness. So, of course, I'm not saying that social media spaces are automatically toxic. I think what I'm saying is three things. One is the type of space that they are. So in social psychology terms, that's a space where we can signal identity, is a space that social psychologists think automatically will, over time, lead to more polarization, not less. Now, not necessarily in a family that's very happy, but if you have a slightly bigger space, there are people you're not necessarily close to, and you signal identity, then you can imagine polarization starts to build. That's the starting point. Then if you add in a business model that encourages the sending of signals of identity, then you encourage polarization, but also you encourage more and more engagement with signals, which encourage more signals. So you create a feedback loop of more and more polarizing signals. And this is just from the business model and the basic nature of the design of the space. And as I was saying to Jan in relation to the patents, Facebook designed these spaces as spaces where we would signal identities more and more, because that would generate useful information about connection, which would enable them to target advertisements better to us. It was part of the design from the beginning. Then you add a third key ingredient, which is why I talk about the space of the world. Again, you could imagine that if these spaces were all sealed off, like prison camps or strange worlds where people do terrible things to each other, but nothing gets out. That would still be bad for the people inside, but it wouldn't be bad for the whole world. But of course, that's not the way the space of social media is, because we're constantly taking in content from other groups, from other platforms, and so on. So, for example, think of the terrible things that have happened in India with images, for example, suggesting that someone attacked a child, when in fact they didn't, because the image was a lie. They're spread within some groups initially, then one group angrily sends it to one other person outside the group, who sends it to their group, and so on. It spreads across the whole network and then spreads to other platforms and so on. And before long, you have hundreds of thousands of people in a large society, maybe hundreds of millions, knowing something, believing they know something which is false, leading to threats to life and so on. So this can happen very fast because the space is so vast. So another thing we need to think about is the fundamental design of the space, that maybe it's not good to connect all spaces up. Maybe there should be less connection between spaces, or as we say in environmental management, fire breaks. In the forest, you have a road that stops the fire spreading from one part of the trees to the next part. That's the exact opposite of what we have with social media. We don't have any fire breaks. So we need to think, and this is moving on to your second point of what type of critical theory we need. We need to draw on the old social psychology, political science. This is still important. And I've been drawing on that to make these points about the type of space. But we also need a new sort of approach to the types of spaces, if you like, that we built. This is not just one space. It's not just about one identity. It's about a sort of universe of identity performance that we've created through social media platforms. And one simple question to ask is, can human beings live in a universe like this? Given that there are always some bad actors, given that human beings do like to signal their identity, given that they are angry for many good reasons, is human solidarity possible in a space this big and this connected? And I think it isn't. And so we need to start thinking about smaller spaces, which we have more social control over, which are not driven by business incentives, which are actually toxic. So it's a big question, but I think that's the type of new spatial question we need to ask. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, that type of spatial thinking did not exist before we had this new type of problem, because space just wasn't connected up that way. No one could have ever imagined that by whispering to my friend and sending an image across a bar to them, I could start a tsunami of images that could cross the world. Unimaginable 40 years ago. Now, for now. So we need to think about that space of spaces. So I have to write the book to give you a better answer, but that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm waiting for new questions. Okay, so maybe while we are waiting for new questions, I will ask one, drawing on the questions of Jan and Przemysław, because I thought about some kind of thought experiment. You told before that the space was reconfigured when the digital platforms becomes to dominate. And could we use critical social theory to wonder what went wrong then and what could we do right in order to be in a better place nowadays?
That's a great question. Just writing it down. Well, I think we can, because, and if you look at the paper I wrote with Depay and Ghosh, which was intended for a policy audience, really. So it was tempting to sort of take these very theoretical ideas and translate them into a language that policy makers might understand. We came up with some practical proposals. So it was an interesting thing to do. Well, one thing we argued there is, I think we wrote a short op-ed somewhere, which is that policymakers need social theory. You can't change this or do anything about this unless you understand how space has changed and how it's now influenced by business models in a way that was impossible 30, 40 years ago. If your social theory comes from 30, 40 years ago, you won't understand what's going on. And yet we all sort of know what's going on, but we don't understand it theoretically. So therefore, we don't think about it. We just say, let's do the old things we used to do. Split up Facebook, for example. Well, as some people have said, splitting up Facebook won't help at all if the business model is wrong. You just have to have small versions of Facebook doing damage. And if they're interconnected, you have exactly the same result as if Facebook had not been split up. And the internet connects everything up. So the old policy methods that won't work unless you think about what's actually happened to space. So first of all, we need to think about what went wrong. And one thing that went wrong was allowing business people to design our space of social life. If you didn't, that's why I told the second half of the lecture in terms of like a fairy tale, a children's story, because it's the life we've all lived. We all know this. We all took part in it. We all use social media, let's assume, at some time in our life, for sure, even if not now. We've all done it. We've all been part of this experiment. But if anyone had told us at the beginning, when Facebook started, if anyone had told us 17 years ago, this is what the experiment was, to connect us up as much as possible, including with bad actors, the other side of the planet, who we don't know, to incentivize those bad actors to send us bad stuff as much as possible, to make it as difficult as possible to get out of the way of the bad stuff, to incentivize us to get angry more often, would we have said yes to that experiment? I really doubt it. But this was the experiment being planned. So one has to tell it as a fairy tale because it is really incredible that we all agreed to this. But of course, there's one reason that we agreed to it. A, because we didn't know what was happening, because it was direct, as going back to the point from Jan, it was hidden from us. This was not revealed. It was kept secret. Facebook kept its internal discussions very secret for a long time. And secondly, the business model was not entirely obvious how it would unpack. It was just a business model, which is, as a business model, it's valid as any other business model until you understand its implications for social space. But to do that, you need a bit of theory about polarization, what causes polarization, and what happens when polarization happens at infinite speed and so on. You get feedback loops and so on. So social theory enables us to see that without social theory, you couldn't fully understand what was going on. And also, you then add the simple political fact that we weren't told what was going to happen. And then I think you can begin to explain how, without anyone exactly planning this, we got into this mess. I say without anyone exactly planning it because although Zuckerberg had a very clear sense of the business model and the patents really clearly design how space will be changed, they actually were not social theorists. So they knew nothing about polarization. They knew nothing about the impact of polarization on politics. They just wanted to make money out of this shadow social world they created. That's all they wanted to do. And they were concentrating on the shadow world, forgetting that it's also the world in which we live. So they were bracketing out all the social stuff and trying to make money faster and faster, more and more effectively. So it's not as if they're evil people. They're not. They're people who just didn't know what they were doing because they didn't have any social theory. So that's why I think, in a sense, we need a movement, because we need to say this should stop. This is not creating the type of space we want to live in. And no one should have the power to create such a space. And we shouldn't agree with them having that power anymore. We should dismantle this space. So I think that's the way I would explain it. It's complicated, but and depressing a little bit, but it is where we are, and we have time, we have a chance to change it. I can see another hand coming up from someone well known to me, I think, Sami Jung.
Hi,
Yes,
Nick.
the floor.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I'm tuning
Tuning
in
in
from
from
South Korea. It's
Ah.
1:30 a.m. here.
Oh,
But it's,
wow.
yeah, it's great to hear your talk. One thing I was thinking about was our agency. You know, we do as users. I mean, we do have the power to refuse and do have the power to say no. However, as you said, because this platform ecosystem has become so, after post pandemic, we're so used to it. Everyone is so used to it. Everyone is numb to all the things that are happening, even though they are getting informed about these new, you know, as you said, all the findings of Twitter or Facebook and Instagram and so on. People can't seem to resist using it. So even if we start a movement, it's just really hard to get people to act. So what are some ways that we can use to really get this going, besides you know, as you said, besides involving the movement?
Well, thanks for the question, Sami, and very nice you could join the call. And last time we spoke was, I guess, a year or so ago. I think my thinking's moved on a little bit since then. So let me try and answer the question a bit better than I could a year ago. I think one thing which I probably said a year ago is that we have to use theory to help us imagine a different future, because otherwise we say, well, this is the way it is. We need to be connected. There's nothing we can do. But then if the consequences are so negative, as I think they are, and we need to do other more important things through our politics, which is deal with climate change and so on, then actually I think we have no choice but to try and do something. So we need, first of all, to imagine a different future, a different way of being connected without these risks. We have to imagine it could be possible to give us hope. Secondly, we have to act together. Individually, none of us can do anything. We all need to be connected to each other. We have to be connected to our families, our friends. We cannot live in isolation. Human beings cannot do that. And we all know from the pandemic, we have to be connected. But that means we also have to act together if we're going to change this social order into a different, better space. We have to do that together through organizing, through solidarity and so on. That's where we need solidarity. We have to find ways of building it in spite of these problems with platforms which still exist. The third thing is that increasingly there are groups of people across the world who are trying to imagine a different type of space of the world, if you like, in my terms, or a different sort of network infrastructure. So there are platforms like Mastodon, which are trying to, if you like, in some way mimic the features of social media platforms, but to do it in ways that are much more under the control of local communities. So, and this goes everything from the level of where the computer servers are. It goes to the sort of protocols and the way they're governed by particular communities, not by a big business in Silicon Valley or in Shanghai. And it goes to how platforms are moderated and who controls that, who sets the policies for moderation. It means this is a more complicated structure because when you want to contact your friend the other side of the world, you may have to move between versions of the same platform type that's created by Mastodon, but there are ways that this works. I haven't tried it myself yet, but many people are worried about what's happening with Twitter, and they're thinking of switching to Mastodon as an alternative to Twitter, which won't be governed by one big corporation, but will have much more decentered power. So these are the beginnings of new ideas which are coming through, which deal with the fundamental organization of the space of the world, if you like. And I think they're very interesting ideas. We have to see how they develop, whether they catch on. they won't catch on unless all of us, whether we're technically skilled or not, share the need to do something different. But just to give one more example, clearly you might feel there's a tension here. To deal with climate change, we need more and more international coordination between governments, between people. All of us need to change our way of life in similar ways, because the challenge is the same one, depending on wherever we live. So, don't we need more coordination? Couldn't social media platforms be a better way to connect us? Well, potentially, yes, but only if we've got more control about whether these platforms are polarizing or not. At the moment, there's an awful lot of bad information circulated through social media platforms about climate change, also about the pandemic, other health risks, and so on. So these are really good examples of how, although we seem to be well connected through the platforms we have, there are actually terrible problems with that. And they're the problems that we can't afford to have, and we need to therefore address them. So I think, difficult though it's going to be, we need to think about different infrastructures for connection and how they could be built. And we need a lot of technical help to do that. But by all means, get in touch with me directly. There are some people working on this that I'm aware of. And I think let's hope those new models grow, because that's what we're going to need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? If no, I think we run out of time. So I think it was a great pleasure for us to have you here, Nick. Thank you very much for the discussion, for answering our questions. And I would like to invite all of you for the next open online seminar, which would be held in October. And our guest then would be Professor Sam Binkley. So I hope to see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening and your questions. Really interesting. Thanks a lot.